A topic that's always been on my mind is the general board gamification of Magic the Gathering. The idea that certain mechanics or the way the game is evolving kind of relates to games outside of a TCG, such as board games, mechanics such as, leveling up or, more dice or just different levels. And obviously, it can be said that without question there are parallels, but I think over the past couple of years it's become more apparent. It's become more apparent that to add new mechanics is to add some things that are generally foreign to most TCGs that people are used to, whether they be anything from Pokemon or maybe anime TCGs like One Piece. Things are going in a different route, and Magic has staying power because of these unique and diverse mechanics that it's able to introduce. A lot of people aren't a fan of them, but I think in this video I wanted to talk about 3 big board games, or in my opinion from what I see are big board games, and how they in a way may not have influenced Magic but have mechanics similar to what we see in Magic right now, and then ultimately at the end talk about whether or not I think this is actually good for Magic, whether or not this type of design is a positive for the game moving forward. And I think a lot of these examples you'll be surprised as to the fact that they've been around for a very long time, and I'm purposely going to leave out a lot of examples, so if you see one that I've missed, please let me know in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the board gamification of Magic in general and whether or not you like it. So let's hop into the first example with the Dark Souls board game, a game where if you're a fan of the FromSoft games or just maybe one of them in general, maybe you got introduced to Elden Ring or something similar like Life of Pi or Lies of Pi, then you see this board game as one where you venture through different levels and areas, you fight big bosses, you level up, you roll some dice, and so you can already see some similar mechanics in a way. So moving through different levels, and one of my favorite levels in all of Dark Souls is the first level that you find in the very first Dark Souls game, the Northern Undead Asylum, a very good tutorial level and one that's actually rather linear up until a point early on. You actually, get a splitting off point, which may actually be unaware to many players that have tried the game. They don't actually know that you can actually go in a different direction, that the first boss that you fight, you can actually take a different route and attack the boss a different way. And so there's different branching off points from there as well. And so venturing through this area is very similar to venturing through a dungeon, one that we've seen come out with the D&D set, where we have 3 different dungeons that came out through this. And this was a very big thing, very big discussion at the time of the board gamification, where you kind of now are not putting dice on your own cards to level them up or make them more powerful. You're now getting passive value from cards that are outside of your hand. You're moving through like a different card, like you're moving through a level, and it's very similar in that mechanic. Dungeon of the Mad Mage, Lost Mine of Phandelver, and then Tomb of Annihilation, very famous D&D locations, and ones that actually have a lot of implications in the game at large right now. We see this implementation, of course, in many older formats where maybe not Dungeon Descent specifically, but the dungeon mechanic and the value that they present is actually very valuable to, again, different Magic decks. You can gain life, you can make your opponent lose life, create creatures, draw cards, everything and in between you can do through the dungeon. So in Legacy, you have decks like Alurin that take advantage of Acererak, the Archlich, and kind of going through the dungeon over and over again to ultimately win through the Tomb of Annihilations. Each player loses 1 life trigger. And then, there's different modes, like each player loses 2 life unless they sacrifice an artifact or a creature. So there's other ways to force life loss, but you can also go through different routes with the oubliette depending on the situation. So again, the dungeon mechanic showing through in a very big way in a age-old combo, reviving the combo in many ways, especially when the dungeons were printed. Right now in Legacy, we see the Boros Initiative deck, which is another evolution of the dungeon mechanic, taking advantage of cards like Ancient Tomb to ramp out, to aggro out the initiative cards like Seasoned Dungeoneer to ultimately go into the initiative, which is the Undercity. And in the Undercity, we have, one of the primary routes being the left side through Secret Entrance to get to trap or target player lose a 5 life, and then Throne of the Dead 3 brings back a creature. There's a lot of things happening here. Board games are very, very much ingrained already, and board game mechanics very much also in Pauper and Legacy, and a lot of our Eternal formats. While they're around in Standard, they're very much played as well. Dungeon Control was definitely a thing done in mid-range. Just value that you get out of these passive abilities was very important, whereas drawing cards and gaining life was very much a passive thing that we did with excess mana. Now it was about going through the dungeon. Now the next board game that I want to talk about is Gloomhaven. And maybe not in the way that you think. Gloomhaven is obviously an adventuring type of game. It's a story-based, kind of you go with the party, and it's one that you usually should be able to play multiple times. And how would you do that with a game with kind of punch outs and writing things down or stickers? How would you play the game over and over again if you use these things, these items? Well, you have removable stickers and maps, and that's one thing that Magic used as well to varying degrees of success with the Unfinity stickers. Now, this wasn't received that well at all, and this was definitely one of the bigger downsides of the board gamification of Magic, trying new things. And I think it was worth it, though. The experiments are there, and we saw Name Sticker Goblin ultimately be the, I guess, the product of this, the biggest implementation of the sticker mechanic, where on Moto we couldn't implement stickers, and so they had to find a different way to do so. They actually added a die rolling mechanic, which was again very controversial because this actually made it a lot more deterministic and better in many ways than the actual version of the blank Goblin. Now it's 3 mana for a 2/2 that always adds mana. It would be 3 mana for 4, or it could be 5, or it could be 6. And so this type of mana ramp was very important in red aggro decks or different combo decks that wanted to try this out online, but had a very different implementation in paper. We see this in this article right here, where it's just kind of blank Goblin. You have to have stickers with different vowels. And so people would argue that, yes, you can determine the amount of mana that you would generate based on the stickers that you keep with you, but then these stickers becoming reusable and then them falling off, and then all this stuff, this extra thing that you have to bring with you other than your deck box and your cards, is very different. And a lot of people, I think, blew this out of proportion when it came to things like that. We bring playmats, we bring dice. And so when it came to the argument of bringing extra materials, I think that argument falls flat. But when it comes to implementation versus online and paper, I think that argument is actually very important. And how this card is now becoming different, it's kind of virtually errated in a way. And so this is a negative implementation of the board gamification of Magic the Gathering. And we see a big positive in the sense of, you know, something personal and dear to my heart with One Land Spy, a recent list that Brian from the Epic Storm posted, where he used Name Sticker Goblin to ramp out. And, you know, ultimately the point of this deck is you Balustrade Spy, mill yourself out from the one land that you have, and reanimate Lot-Led Giant. You put your whole deck in your graveyard, you have a bunch of creatures in there. Lot-Led Giant ETB deals 1 damage for each creature in your graveyard to an opponent. So you do all this stuff, combo out Lot-Led Giant, and Name Sticker Goblin was actually a big way to do it. I highly recommend checking out the video. I'll link it down below. Very good video. But again, a negative implementation used positively in an eternal format, and actually has constructed implications, I should say. The last board game that I want to talk about is Terraforming Mars. Now, me personally, let me know if you're this far in the video in the comment section down below. What is your favorite board game? Because Terraforming Mars is mine. If you ask me for a game in Terraforming Mars, I'm going to try and do my best to clear my schedule to play some with you. So let me know as well if you want to play some Terraforming Mars with me. But the big point from this game that I want to talk about is so many things like resource gathering and getting different trophies and working against your opponent. Specifically, I want to talk about the factions and the corporations in Terraforming Mars have so many different bonuses for you, and they kind of lead you in a direction. Whereas they give you a starting bonus or maybe a different type of trading resource that your other opponents don't have. Maybe they let you trade easier into different resources, or they give you more starting bonuses. And in many ways, choosing a corporation leads you down a direction. You don't really want to work against this. It's kind of like, in many ways, an implementation of a multiplayer format that has taken over the game of Magic, becoming probably the most played format in all of Magic the Gathering's history. And that's Commander, EDH, in many ways, where when you pick a commander, you go down that route to the commander. You're stuck to the building restrictions of the colors, and you usually want to build into the mechanics of it. And so the restrictions of the commander can act like the board game. You can't really play outside of the board game, and the mechanics of the commander itself kind of act like the faction, where you can build outside of your commander and never cast your commander or whatever. It could just be a fun little hidden deck, or you could just work with it, hyper synergize, build your engine, and go from there. In many ways, Commander is the definition of the board gamification of Magic. It is the way that many of these mechanics have introduced themselves into Magic as multiplayer effects and different things that say each opponent. The evolution of cards that attack all players and not just target opponent has been an interesting one to see over the past couple of years. And I personally have obviously experienced that through my mill decks, and seeing things get around hexproof effects is always a welcome thing, but it has larger implications and it comes from things like this. And I think it's really interesting to think of Commander this way, and how it may not have sprung from board games directly, but in a way was the first implementation of a board game style effect in Magic, and one that's very successful, one that hides itself, and it doesn't exactly have a fancy little box, and it's not exactly having little miniatures and all that stuff, but it has all the makings of a board game. Think of a card like Feldegriff, where with Feldegriff, all these abilities, you have so many ways that you could build it. You could build Group Hug, Wheels, Karuga, Pillow Fort, and just highlighting on EDH Rec that there's so many ways to build a commander, similar to the factions in Terraforming Mars. And ultimately, the question comes down to, was this worth it? Is the board gamification, the diversification, and the implementation of all of these new mechanics, analogous abilities, and things that other games are doing, is it worth it for Magic to do? And I think there's two ways to discuss this. I think firstly, it's the limitations. And I think the sticker one is a very alarming one that's come up rather recently, where Magic Online wasn't able to implement the sticker mechanic very well. And I don't believe Arena has an implementation for it either, because those cards aren't legal on Arena yet. Maybe they bring them in the future. But if they're not able to be implemented across the board in a uniform manner, that presents itself with a problem, because a lot of players may be playing online and then they come into paper and they read the card and they're like, well, this is different. This isn't what my card does. Why doesn't it do that? Or when they're playing with the card in paper, maybe online, the implementation is completely different. Maybe there is a player out there that's able to rule 0 in Sticker Goblin into their EDH deck, and they see it in One Land Spy and Pauper and they're like, well, this is different. Where's my sticker deck? And so I think limitations like this are very important to keep in mind. I don't think we should bring back stickers, but I think if we're going to implement pieces like this or mechanics like this, it's important to understand first where the problems lie before just seeing if it'll sell packs or if players will like it. But I think ultimately it's good because of the diversity. You have to innovate, you have to bring aboard new ideas, and you have to keep trying. Similar to the companion mechanic that the Wizards design team largely sees as a failure, and the additions to, the storm scale at large, many mechanics don't succeed. Some become evergreen. And that's okay. You have to try. You have to do new things for the game to evolve. And that's why Magic has been around for 25, 30 years. The game is good. The game is evolving. The game has so many ways to access it. And the quote unquote board gamification of the game is important to that. It's crucial. As we see, and again, from my opinion, what I've shown, formats like Commander are very important to that. Implementations such as the dungeon mechanic is very important for constructed players even. It's important to see that we shouldn't be so close-minded to the introductions of other games and other styles of play being introduced into our TCG. It's important for the game. And that's why I ultimately think that, well, at the end of the day, it is good for the game. We don't have to become a board game. We don't have to open up a box, set up a bunch of things, convince our friends to play with us. Sometimes it's easier to play a game of Magic, but these type of mechanics can exist to create further complexity and diversity and choices in the way that you want to play your decks and represent yourself. I mean, take a look at examples like Urza's Saga, where you kind of evolve through different chapters, you move through different levels and gain different abilities. It's kind of like you're building an engine in a way. And then you have mechanics like Invasion of Alara with the battles, where you attach it to your opponent, you have to attack into it, and that's part of your game plan. This is kind of like the board gamification. It's like you're attacking like a leader. Like in the One Piece TCG, you don't attack your opponent, you attack their card, their leader. And so this is like introducing a whole new player, like you're attacking something different, which is what kind of the Planeswalkers did. And so all these different mechanics are so interesting, and they may fail, again, as I mentioned multiple times, like the battles, but they may succeed, like the Planeswalkers, adding whole new player mechanics essentially into the board state. And although your opinions of whether or not those are mistakes or not, I think we can all agree that ultimately, when it comes to any ability or introduction of any mechanic into the game of Magic, they all just kicker at the end of the day, right?